$240.00 for this? The man's voice was calm, but the entire restaurant froze. No one realized the elderly diner they were mistreating owned the place, and he was testing them all. But when Keanu Reeves stood up and revealed who he really was, everything changed. What happened next stunned the staff and saved a life. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The front doors of Oak and Ember whispered open at 7:12 p.m., letting in a breeze of late summer air and a man no one paid much attention to. His shoes were scuffed, his blazer slightly oversized, and his glasses thick enough to hide his eyes beneath a reflection of ceiling lights. His beard was a patchy gray mess, and his hair, hidden under a knit cap, suggested the tired dignity of an aging professor more than a Hollywood legend. He didn't enter like someone important. He entered like someone curious. The restaurant buzzed with quiet conversation and the soft clink of utensils against porcelain. Jazz hummed from the ceiling speakers, low enough to be ignored but deliberate enough to set a tone. Couples sat across candlelit tables. Business professionals sipped on wine while checking their watches, and a bachelorette party toasted near the bar, oblivious to everything outside their bubble. Nobody looked at him twice. That was exactly what he wanted. Keanu Reeves hadn't set foot in Oak and Ember for over a year. He had invested in it with a silent partner contract, not because he wanted to profit off Wagyu and wine, but because he wanted to create a space that reflected his values: quiet dignity, honest service, simple excellence. He didn't want his name on the building. He didn't want photo ops. All he wanted was a place where people could come and feel cared for. But lately, emails had started trickling in. A staff member anonymously mentioned burnout. A Yelp review described a cold, joyless atmosphere. And just last week, someone claimed their server cried in the back hallway after a customer berated them, while management stood by and did nothing. Keanu didn't want to believe it, but he also knew better than to ignore the signs. So tonight, he returned, not as Keanu Reeves, not as a celebrity, not as the owner. He came as Mr. Keller, a retired insurance adjuster with a stiff knee, a quiet demeanor, and a craving for red meat. As he stepped inside and looked around, he felt both the warmth and the weight of the place. It still had the soft lighting, the mahogany wood grain walls, the custom pendant fixtures hanging like glowing amber fruit. But something in the air felt thinner, like the hospitality had faded behind the script. "Good evening," came a voice from the front. It was the host, young, well-groomed, clearly rehearsed. "Do you have a reservation, sir?" Keanu didn't flinch. He shook his head and replied in a lower tone than usual. "Just one, if that's okay." The host hesitated a beat, checked the tablet, then nodded. "We can fit you in." And just like that, Keanu Reeves, the man whose name was quietly buried in the investor papers of this very building, was led into his own restaurant without a trace of recognition. The host passed the table off to a server with a tired gait and a clipboard tucked beneath one arm. Mason looked to be in his late 20s, maybe early 30s. His sleeves were rolled just above the elbows, revealing faint, reddish indentations from carrying heavy trays too many nights in a row. His hair was short, slightly unkempt, and his expression said everything. Exhausted but polite, numb but trying. "Table for one?" Mason asked, his voice smooth but low, like someone conserving energy. Keanu nodded once, adjusting his glasses. "Right this way, sir." He followed Mason to a booth near the far wall, tucked beside a shelf of decorative wine bottles. It was just close enough to hear the hum of the kitchen, but far enough that no one would think to linger there. Keanu had chosen the perfect vantage point without even requesting it. It gave him a full view of the floor, the pacing of the servers, the timing of the dishes. He could see the team in motion, or the cracks forming in between. Mason handed him a leather-bound menu, gently worn at the corners. "If you need any recommendations, I'm happy to help," he said. Keanu didn't take the menu. He looked Mason squarely in the eye. His voice dropped just enough to create tension. "Bring me the most expensive thing on the menu, no substitutions, no modifications." Mason blinked. He opened his mouth as if to clarify, but Keanu cut that possibility off with a second glance. The message was clear. This wasn't a request to debate. "Yes, sir," Mason said, nodding. "Would you like water in the meantime?" Keanu didn't respond right away. He allowed the silence to stretch for just a breath longer than polite. "Cold, ice, and clean glassware." Mason gave another nod, this one stiffer. "Right away." As he walked off, Keanu adjusted himself in the booth. The cushion felt a bit too firm, the lighting a touch too dim. He took in every surface, every smell, every step from the kitchen to the bar. It was clear the place still had its polish. But that wasn't what he was looking for. He wasn't here to check the lighting. He was here to check the people. Keanu remembered how it had all started. He and a small team of dreamers had built Oak and Ember from nothing. No PR campaign, no glossy magazine ads, just a vision. Serve people well, treat staff like family, and do it all without needing to shout. That was the spirit he had asked them to protect. But spirit was invisible, and tonight he was here to see whether it still lived between the walls, or whether it had quietly died without anyone noticing. Mason returned with a tall glass of water, ice clinking softly inside. He placed it gently on the table with a folded napkin underneath. "Your water, sir," he said with a tired but professional tone. Keanu lifted the glass and held it to the light. He swirled it once, then took a sip. He set it down just as slowly. "This is room temperature." Mason blinked. "I'm sorry, sir. I asked for cold water, with ice. This is neither." Mason's face didn't move, but something in his eyes dimmed. He gave a short nod, took the glass, and turned back toward the kitchen. Keanu watched every step. He wasn't trying to be cruel, he wasn't looking to embarrass anyone. But the truth was often quiet. It had to be coaxed out. And the truth of a place didn't live in the PR packages or the perfectly arranged dishes. It lived in the tired hands, the reflexes, the details. That glass of water told him more than any quarterly report ever could. Back behind the kitchen swing doors, Mason moved quickly to get a fresh glass. He opened a new bottle, added more ice, and carried it back with care. Keanu didn't look at him when he set it down. He took another sip, then slowly pushed the glass aside. "This tastes like plastic. Try again." Mason stood still for half a second, then nodded. "Yes, sir." He left without complaint. No sigh, no protest. But Keanu noticed the tremble in his fingers. It wasn't just the water. It was the weight. Keanu leaned back into the booth and stared across the dining room. Two servers argued quietly near the bread station. A busboy dropped a fork and didn't pick it up for nearly a full minute. At the bar, a woman waiting on her drink was scrolling through her phone, glancing up every few seconds with growing impatience. No one checked on her. He'd be on him. The walls still gleamed. The tablecloths were crisp. The candles flickered with warmth. But something vital was missing. And Keanu knew this kind of erosion didn't happen overnight. It crept in slowly. A missed shift here, a rushed prep there, a new manager who didn't care about old promises. And eventually, even the most thoughtful place could lose its way. That's why he had come. Not to fire people, not to shame them, but to look into the heart of what he helped build and ask the most important question a leader could ask. Is this still worth fighting for? He hadn't answered that yet, not even to himself. But as Mason returned once more, setting down a third glass of water with a barely audible breath, Keanu's eyes narrowed slightly. The test had only just begun. The third glass of water sat untouched. Keanu's eyes rested on it as if studying a puzzle no one else could see. Across the table, the menu remained closed, pristine, still resting on its folded napkin. Mason waited nearby, trying to maintain his composure, though the weight of the interaction was beginning to press against his shoulders like invisible bricks. "Do you need a moment to look over the menu, sir?" Mason asked, voice smooth but fading at the edges. Keanu turned his head slowly, finally meeting Mason's gaze. "No," he said simply. "Bring me the most expensive item you serve." Mason blinked. "The most expensive?" Keanu nodded once. "Your signature, no substitutions." There was something about the way he said it. Calm, quiet, but sharp enough to cut through the air like a razor. Mason swallowed the urge to ask more. It wasn't the first time a customer made a strange request. It wouldn't be the last. Still, something about this one felt different. Not rude, not arrogant, just unsettling. "Yes, sir," Mason said, with a professional nod. He turned quickly and walked back toward the kitchen. Behind him, Keanu folded his hands on the table and stared forward. He wasn't hungry, not really. Not for food. What he needed to taste tonight couldn't be seasoned. In the kitchen, the grill sizzled, knives tapped against cutting boards, and the air carried the scent of garlic, rosemary, and seared fat. Mason approached the monitor and began punching in the order. "Wagyu tomahawk," he murmured. "Black garlic butter, no subs. Add the 30-year aged pairing, table 13. Talia, the head chef, looked up from the plating station with narrowed eyes. Her hair was tied in a tight knot, apron spotless despite the chaos, and her voice cut through the noise like a kitchen bell. "Who ordered that?" "Corner booth. Solo guest." Talia raised a brow. "On a Wednesday?" Mason shrugged. "Didn't open the menu, just asked for our most expensive item." Talia eyed him for a beat. "You sure he's not from corporate?" Mason gave a soft laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "Trust me, corporate doesn't sit in corner booths in cardigans and ask for ice water 3 times. Talia didn't smile. She simply turned to her team and barked the call. "Wagyu, medium rare. Start the butter now, wine pairing on standby." Back at table 13, Keanu adjusted slightly in his seat. The light from the pendant above cast a warm hue across his face, catching in the lenses of his thick glasses. His disguise was holding. His silence had already begun shifting the mood around him. And still, not a single person recognized who he was. That too was part of the test. He didn't want their praise. He wanted their truth. And Mason was about to show him more of it than he realized. Mason returned to the floor, wiping his hands on the edge of his apron, trying to shake the nerves loose. He took a deep breath near the bar before returning to the table. The third glass of water still sat untouched. The guest hadn't moved, hadn't flipped through the menu, hadn't even pulled out a phone like everyone else in the room. It was unnatural. "Your order is being prepared, sir," Mason said as he approached. Keanu didn't look up. He seemed almost too still, like someone waiting for a moment to unfold rather than a meal. Mason hesitated, unsure if he should remain or go. Keanu finally spoke, voice even and dispassionate. "What kind of cut is it?" "Tomahawk ribeye, sir. Wagyu grade A5. Imported?" Keanu gave a small nod. "And the wine?" 30-year Bordeaux. It's one of our finest." Still, the guest didn't lift his gaze. He simply tilted his head slightly. "I assume you've tasted both?" Mason hesitated. "I've had the wine once." "The steak?" "No, sir." Keanu's mouth didn't move, but something flickered in his eyes behind the glasses. "Then how do you know it's your finest?" The question landed with weight, even though it was spoken gently. Mason didn't know how to answer it. He felt his pulse quicken, though his face remained neutral. He cleared his throat. "It's what the guests usually say." "That's not what I asked." Keanu's tone wasn't cruel, but it had the kind of clarity that left no room for evasion. Mason tried to speak, but Keanu raised one hand. It's fine, forget it. I'll decide for myself. Mason gave a stiff nod and stepped back, returning to his other tables. But the air around him felt heavier now. The man at table 13 wasn't loud, wasn't rude, but he radiated something that made Mason uneasy. Not in a dangerous way, more like standing in front of a mirror you didn't want to look into. Back in the kitchen, the steak sizzled on the flat top. Talia hovered over it like a surgeon. She basted it with precision, the garlic butter bubbling as it soaked into the crust. One of the line cooks leaned toward her. "You think he's a critic?" Talia didn't answer. She just kept working, brow furrowed. On the floor, Mason brought wine to a nearby table, poured carefully, smiled, made polite conversation. But his mind kept drifting to the man in the corner. Still sitting, still silent, still watching everything around him with eyes that didn't blink often enough. It wasn't arrogance. That's what made it worse. It was patience. A deliberate stillness that made Mason feel like every second he spent nearby was being measured and filed away. He began to feel watched, not in a paranoid way, but in a way that made his every step feel heavier. When the steak was finally ready, Talia inspected the plate with intensity. The tomahawk bone extended like a handle of ceremony, resting against a bed of truffle-mashed potatoes, with a small ramekin of black garlic butter perched on the edge. The wine sat beside it, deep red and breathing. It was the kind of dish they reserved for anniversaries, for celebrations, for people who wore diamonds and left 5-star reviews. "Take it out," Talia said without looking up. Mason dried his palms on his apron and carried the plate to table 13. Each step echoed in his chest. When he reached the booth, the guest didn't look at him. Mason gently set the plate down and announced, "Your Wagyu, sir, medium rare, as requested. Garlic butter on the side. Your wine is coming right behind." Keanu gave a single nod. That was all. Mason stepped back. No compliment. No reaction. Just silence. Keanu picked up his knife, testing the weight. Then, slowly and without fanfare, he sliced into the meat. One clean cut. One bite. He chewed, swallowed, then set his utensils down neatly, and leaned back in his chair. Mason waited for a verdict, unsure why he cared so much. Keanu didn't speak at first. He just let the silence grow, the kind of silence that filled the space between two heartbeats when something important was about to be said. Finally, he exhaled slowly through his nose. "I've had better." At truck stops, Mason froze. Keanu tapped the edge of the plate gently. "This is a $240 0-cent experience, and it tastes like reheated memory." Mason didn't speak, couldn't. Keanu looked up for the first time in several minutes. His gaze pierced through the glasses, through the disguise. Not angry, not smug, just assessing. "Do you believe this is worth what you charge?" Mason's voice was barely above a whisper. "Sir, I don't." "It's not a trick question." Mason looked down at the plate, then back up. "I'm just the server, sir." Keanu tilted his head slightly. "And yet, you represent the whole place." That landed hard. Mason's jaw clenched. He took the plate with both hands and nodded. "Would you like me to send it back to the kitchen?" "No," Keanu said. "Let it sit. I'm not hungry anymore." Mason hesitated, then slowly backed away. At the service station, he gripped the counter for support, knuckles white. Talia glanced at him from the kitchen window, brows furrowed. He avoided her gaze. In the corner, Keanu remained still, sipping once from the wine. He set the glass down without comment, then looked up again, across the restaurant, at Mason, and waited. It was the beginning of something no one else in that restaurant could see yet, but Mason would feel it. Very soon. Mason ducked behind the bar, out of view, and finally let his shoulders sag. His pulse still hadn't slowed since the last interaction. He wiped his forehead with a napkin and glanced at the screen showing the open tables. 8 active guests, 3 pending drink orders, 1 disgruntled VIP at table 13, and no time to breathe. He stepped into the narrow hallway leading to the kitchen, where the swinging doors slapped shut behind him. The air inside was thicker, hotter, filled with the hiss of searing meat and the frantic clicks of utensils. Talia shouted over the clatter, "Is he still sitting on that plate?" Mason didn't answer right away. Blake appeared from the walk-in cooler, clipboard in hand and sleeves rolled halfway. His mouth twisted into a smirk when he saw Mason. "What's wrong with our old friend at table 13? He allergic to flavor or just trying to get a comp?" Mason gave a tired glance. "He said he wasn't hungry anymore," Blake scoffed. "Then he shouldn't have ordered a $100 steak. I swear these people think they're Michelin critics when they barely know the difference between medium and medium rare." Talia watched the exchange in silence, her arms folded. There was something about the guest's tone that still lingered with her. Controlled. Intentional. It wasn't just entitlement. It was surgical. "Did he say anything else?" she asked. Mason shook his head. "Just stared, didn't touch the glass again. Didn't touch the plate." Blake snorted. "Let him stew. We've got real customers to take care of." Mason didn't respond. He turned to grab silverware for another table when his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out quickly, screen cracked from a fall 2 weeks ago. It read, "Emily calling." He checked the time. Nearly 8 o'clock. His heart sank. He stepped to the side of the hallway, just out of sight of the line cooks, and answered quietly. Emily's voice came through, soft and low. "Mason, are you at work?" "Yeah," he whispered, glancing toward the kitchen window. "What's wrong?" "It's Mom," Emily said, her voice trembling. "The hospital called about her blood work. They want to start a new round of treatment next week." "But the copay just doubled." Mason closed his eyes. "How much?" Emily said, "Close to 800. Up front." He rubbed his temple, heart pounding. "I can try to pick up another shift." "You're already doing doubles," she said gently. "I just thought you should know." There was a pause. "I'm sorry," Emily added. "No," Mason said quickly. "Don't be. I'll figure it out. I always do." "I know," she whispered. "You always do." He ended the call and tucked the phone back into his apron pocket. Then he stood there for a moment, letting the noise of the kitchen mask the panic rising in his chest. It wasn't just a steak on that table anymore. It was another crack in a wall he was struggling to hold upright. Mason re-entered the dining room like a man returning to battle. The smile slid back onto his face, but it didn't have roots. It floated on the surface, barely held in place by habit. He moved from table to table, pouring water, clearing plates, and offering soft apologies for minor delays. But his mind was elsewhere. Every sound felt louder now. The clang of silverware, the clink of glass, the soft murmur of complaints whispered behind hands. He moved faster to compensate, but his hands weren't steady. When he tried to refill a glass of wine at table 5, a single drop hit the white tablecloth. The woman stared at it like it was an insult. Mason murmured an apology, folded the corner of the cloth over the drop, and kept going. He made his way back toward table 13. The man was still seated, still staring forward, his plate untouched, his wine half full. Mason stopped beside him, trying to soften his voice. "Would you like me to have the kitchen prepare something else, sir?" Keanu slowly looked up at him. "No," he said, quiet but unflinching. "I didn't come for variety. I came for quality." Mason held his breath, unsure what to say. Keanu picked up his knife again, the same deliberate way as before, and sliced a second piece from the steak. He chewed, slow, thoughtful. His face didn't change. Then he placed the knife and fork down on the plate and wiped his mouth with the cloth napkin. His voice was low, but every word was clear. "This is not steak, this is shame." Mason blinked. "I'm sorry?" Keanu's eyes didn't waver. "Unworthy," he said flatly, as if offering a final judgment in a courtroom. A $240.00 insult dressed up in garnishes. The words landed like ice water. Mason's fingers twitched, but he didn't move. He stood still, frozen beside the booth, as though trying to process whether he'd just been insulted personally or professionally. Keanu tapped the plate gently with his index finger. If I wanted a reminder of failure, I would have stayed home. The restaurant around them didn't notice, not yet. A birthday song played softly near the bar. Someone laughed too loudly at a different table, but to Mason, the entire room had gone quiet. His jaw clenched. He didn't reply. He couldn't. There was no playbook for this moment, no guidebook in the training manual titled, "When a stranger quietly dismantles your pride in front of a full room." He nodded once, his lips pressed tightly together. "I'll inform the kitchen." He stepped away, eyes lowered, hands tightening around the serving tray, like it was the only solid thing left to hold on to. Behind him, Keanu leaned back in the booth, still silent, still watching, and still waiting, because the test wasn't over. Mason slipped into the back hallway again, this time gripping the corner of the prep counter for balance. His heart was pounding harder now, not just from the words, but from what they revealed. He had always believed if he kept his head down, if he just kept moving, kept serving, kept pushing forward, eventually it would be enough. But tonight, the cracks were showing, not just in the steak or the service, in him. Blake spotted him leaning and chuckled from the corner. "What'd the old man say now? Want you to massage the cow next time?" Mason didn't laugh. Talia glanced up from a finishing station and looked toward him, her expression unreadable. She wasn't one for sympathy, but tonight something about Mason's posture struck her. "You good?" she asked. "Yeah," Mason replied, too quickly. "Just need a minute." Blake muttered under his breath. "If he sends that plate back, we're not making another. I don't care if he's the Pope." Mason nodded vaguely, not really hearing. His phone buzzed again in his apron, and he knew who it was. He didn't check it. He didn't have the strength. Instead, he straightened his apron and stepped back through the swinging doors into the dining room. The music hadn't changed, neither had the lights. Everything looked the same, but he felt like he was walking underwater. He moved toward table 13 with careful steps, dreading whatever came next. Keanu hadn't moved. He still sat perfectly still, his hands now folded neatly on the table. The steak remained mostly untouched. The wine glass had been rotated slightly, as if it had been examined rather than consumed. Mason approached cautiously. "Would you like me to remove the plate, sir?" Keanu's eyes met his. Mason felt the air leave his lungs. "Do you believe in your work?" Keanu asked. Myrna smiled. Mason blinked. "Sir?" Keanu didn't repeat it, he simply waited. Mason's throat tightened. The question wasn't about the food. It wasn't even about the job. It was about the weight behind every tray, every glass, every step he took from sunrise to close. "I try," Mason answered. Keanu's gaze didn't shift. Trying isn't always enough. Not if you forget why you started. Mason stood still, unsure if this was criticism or some kind of warning. Then Keanu gave a slow nod, almost to himself. "Take the plate, we're done with this." Mason collected it gently, hands steady despite the fire in his chest. He turned and walked away as the birthday table clapped in the distance, singing off-key. The sound didn't reach him. He entered the kitchen like a ghost and set the plate on the counter. Talia looked down at the nearly full steak. What did he say this time? Mason didn't answer. He just leaned against the wall, eyes closed, breath shallow, the words still echoing in his head. "This is not steak. This is shame." The moment Talia saw the steak come back untouched, she stiffened. The glistening tomahawk, once plated with care and pride, now sat on the stainless steel counter like an accusation. No cuts beyond the first, barely disturbed. Rejected. She didn't wait for questions. Tearing off her gloves, she stormed through the kitchen door and out onto the floor. Her apron flared at the edges with every step. Mason noticed her out of the corner of his eye, but didn't speak. Talia didn't need permission. She had built her reputation on passion, precision, and a zero-tolerance policy for waste, especially when it came to her best dishes. She arrived at table 13 and stood beside Keanu, folding her arms tightly. "I understand you weren't satisfied with your steak, sir." Keanu didn't look at her right away. He finished dabbing his mouth with the napkin, then turned his head slowly. "I expected better." Talia opened her mouth, but the tone of his voice silenced her. It wasn't harsh or loud, just firm, final, and coming from someone who clearly wasn't interested in a debate. He didn't offer notes, no suggestions, just that one sentence. Talia blinked, then looked down at the untouched plate Mason had left on the counter. She wasn't used to silence carrying that much weight. "Wait, would you care to elaborate?" she asked, trying to maintain composure. No, it was not disrespectful. It was just enough to stop her in her tracks. Talia stood still for a few seconds longer, then gave a short, sharp nod and walked away, her jaw tight. Back near the kitchen, Blake leaned against the bar, sipping flat soda from a to-go cup. He caught Talia's expression as she passed. "What, our VIP didn't worship the meat?" She didn't respond. Blake shrugged. Just another entitled diner, trying to act important. Talia snapped her towel down hard onto the prep station. "He's not just acting. He's studying everything." Blake raised a brow. "Like he's undercover?" Talia didn't answer, but her silence said enough. Meanwhile, Mason was still moving through his shift like a ghost, but he couldn't shake the way Keanu had looked at him. There was no anger in those eyes, no arrogance, just attention, careful attention. Like the man wasn't just judging the food, but judging him. And somehow, that felt worse. Mason approached table 13 again, this time to offer a fresh napkin, folded with perfect symmetry. Keanu didn't smile, didn't even glance at the cloth. "This napkin smells like bleach," he muttered. "Bring another." Mason blinked. "Of course, sir." He walked away again, trying to keep his breathing even. This wasn't service anymore. This was survival. And every word from that booth felt like another notch tightening around his ribs. In the back storage room, Mason sorted through a stack of napkins, lifting each one to his nose. The first smelled faintly of detergent. The second carried a trace of lemon sanitizer. The third was almost scentless. He chose that one and folded it tightly, corners aligned, seams straight. He paused for a moment, resting one hand against the shelf to steady himself. His knees ached. His lower back throbbed from the 14-hour double he was barely halfway through. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. When he returned to the floor and gently placed the napkin in front of the guest, Keanu didn't acknowledge it. Instead, he looked at Mason's posture, his breathing, his hands. "This chair," Keanu said slowly. "It's like sitting on concrete. Replace it?" Mason's eyes darted to the chair. It was a standard booth seat. Firm, yes, but not broken. Still, he nodded. "I'll bring one from the lounge." Keanu gave no reply. Mason walked to the side of the restaurant, where the upholstered lounge chairs sat unused at this hour. He selected one, heavier than expected, and carried it back with both hands. He set it down quietly, aligning it perfectly with the table. Keanu shifted into the new seat without a word. Then finally he spoke again. "Your speed is impressive," he said, tone dry. "I've never seen anyone move so slowly." Mason stood frozen, unsure if he was meant to laugh. He didn't. Instead, he straightened his apron and replied with only 2 words. "Thank you, sir." Keanu didn't react. He simply reached for the fresh water glass that had been quietly placed during Mason's absence. He swirled it once, took a sip, then set it down. It tastes like dish soap. Mason blinked. "Would you like another glass?" Keanu leaned forward slightly. "I'd like care, but if that's too expensive, just Bring me water that doesn't taste like regret." The words weren't shouted. There was no scene. But Mason felt them like a weight on his chest. He turned and walked back toward the bar where Elena, the senior bartender, was wiping down a muddler with practiced hands. She looked up. "Again?" she asked softly. Mason nodded, setting the glass down beside her. "This one tasted like dish soap," he said. She frowned and filled a new one carefully from the filtered tap, then added ice cubes by hand. Not from the scoop bin, from a fresh tray. "No soap, no bleach, no excuses," she muttered as she handed it to him. Mason took it back to the table, set it down carefully. Keanu didn't speak. He just looked up at Mason and said, almost under his breath, "You've made hospitality look mechanical." Mason flinched. His hand trembled again. But he didn't argue. He couldn't. Mason turned from the table, walking slowly toward the service station, his spine rigid, shoulders tight. He felt the pressure building in his chest, like a rising tide he was trying to keep sealed behind his ribs. The comment had pierced deeper than any shouted complaint ever could. Mechanical. It wasn't the insult that stung. It was the truth he heard in it. He wasn't serving anymore, he was just moving. Routine had replaced pride. Speed had replaced presence. He had become what the job had demanded of him. Silent, efficient, and numb. And now somehow this stranger had seen right through the armor. Blake passed behind him with a laugh. "Don't tell me he's still going," he said, pointing a thumb toward table 13. "What's he want now, a massage and a violinist?" Mason didn't respond. Elena caught the edge of the conversation as she slid a tray of mocktails onto a side table. Her brow furrowed. She glanced toward Mason, then toward the guest. The man hadn't moved much all night, but there was something about him. Something intentional. Elena didn't know who he was, but she knew he wasn't just another diner. She whispered to Mason, "Is he corporate?" "I don't think so," Mason replied quietly. "He's something else." Elena gave a slow nod. "Well, he's got the whole room off balance. Even Talia hasn't stepped out of the kitchen again." Mason managed a small breath through his nose and glanced at the clock. He still had 4 more hours on shift. The phone in his apron buzzed again. He ignored it. Returning to table 13, he stood still for a moment before speaking. "Would you like anything else, sir?" Keanu looked up at him, not with anger, not even with disappointment. Just steady, observant quiet. "No," he said. "Not food, not drink." Mason nodded slightly, unsure what else to say. Keanu added, "Do you know what the worst part is?" Mason hesitated. "Sir?" Keanu spoke softly. "You don't even realize you're breaking." The words struck deep. Mason's chest tightened. His breath caught, just for a second. The room around him seemed to fall away. He didn't respond. Keanu gave no follow-up. He leaned back, as if the conversation had ended, as if he'd merely stated a weather report. Mason stepped away, hands at his sides, eyes lowered. He didn't return to the kitchen. Not yet. Instead, he walked to the far end of the hallway, just beside the restrooms, where no one could see him. There, he let himself lean against the wall. He didn't cry, but for a long moment, he didn't breathe right either. Because something about that table, about that man, had cut deeper than all the long hours and bitter nights combined. And Mason had no idea why. The replacement steak arrived with the same golden crust and artful garnishing. Talia herself double-checked the temperature before plating. It was flawless, at least by appearance. Mason placed it gently in front of the guest without a word. Keanu didn't touch it. Not the knife, not the fork, not even the glass of wine beside it. He just stared ahead, quiet as ever, eyes following Mason even after he walked away. Mason moved through the dining room, slower now. Each step felt heavier than the last. His shoes dragged slightly, revealing the faint limp that had developed over months of doubles, bad posture, and zero recovery. His apron was creased and dusted with faint flour near the hem. His name tag hung crookedly over his heart. He didn't have the strength to fix it. "Greet, my heart is strong," he thought. He just had to tell Mason that he'd been fortunate enough to find the herb of life governing his heartbeats. His maid's tag was hauntedly faint. When he smiled, it barely touched the corners of his mouth. At table 9, a man complained about undercooked asparagus. At table 2, a child dropped a spoon and started crying. Mason handled it all with practiced grace, but inside something was unraveling. His thoughts moved too fast to catch. He couldn't stop wondering if that comment, "You don't even realize you're breaking," was true. Was this what breaking looked like? Quiet, hidden, slow? Blake watched him from the bar, sipping soda like it was a cocktail and shaking his head. "You're limping again," Blake said, when Mason came up for a refill. "I'm fine," Mason replied without pause. Blake scoffed. "You're not fine, you're slow. I'm doing my best." "Your best won't matter when customers walk out." Mason said nothing. He filled the water jug and turned to leave. Blake called after him, "And fix your shirt, you look like you slept in a laundry basket." Mason didn't turn around. At table 13, Keanu's eyes followed every move. Every tray delivered. Every apology spoken. Every silent moment where Mason rubbed his wrist behind his back, trying to push the ache down. He hadn't touched the steak again. He waited until Mason returned to check in. Keanu lifted his eyes. "Do you know where this Wagyu comes from?" Mason paused. "It's imported, sir. From Japan." Keanu's voice sharpened slightly. "Which region?" Mason opened his mouth, then closed it. His tongue sat like lead. I'm not sure." Keanu nodded slowly. "Not sure." He leaned back. "You're selling something you don't understand." Mason stood silent, eyes trained somewhere on the floor near Keanu's shoes. He wanted to say it wasn't his job to know that level of detail, that no one had ever trained him on sourcing, that he was just trying to keep the wheels turning. But none of those words came out. Keanu said nothing more. He didn't need to. The silence that followed said more than reprimands ever could. Mason turned away from the table, the question still echoing in his head. Which region? It should have been simple, but it wasn't. Not when his entire focus had narrowed to surviving the shift. There was no room left for curiosity when exhaustion took up all the space. He made his way to the side station and leaned slightly against the counter, pretending to organize a tray of cutlery while stealing a moment to breathe. Elena glanced at him as she passed, slowing just a little. "You okay?" she asked under her breath. Mason gave a short nod, but it wasn't convincing. She didn't press, just placed a fresh bar towel beside him and moved on. He watched her walk away, wondering how she made it look so easy. Maybe it was because she didn't take things personally. Or maybe she just hadn't cracked yet. He reached up to adjust his name tag. It slipped again. Somewhere across the restaurant, a plate shattered. A young server dropped a ramekin of sauce near the hostess stand and tried to laugh it off. Blake rolled his eyes from the bar and muttered something about amateurs. And still, at table 13, the guest sat silently. Keanu hadn't touched the steak. Not even a slice this time. It remained perfectly intact, its garnish still untouched, the garlic butter unmelted. Mason approached cautiously. "Is there something wrong with the second dish, sir?" Keanu didn't answer right away. He reached for the glass of water, took a single sip, then placed it down with slow precision. "You served me something that cost hundreds of dollars," he said finally. "But you don't know where it came from." Mason's throat tightened. Keanu leaned in just slightly. "You know what that tells me?" Mason shook his head. Keanu's voice remained quiet, but it carried weight. People who tried to ruin him every week of his life. "Then no one ever taught you to care." The word struck deeper than Mason expected. His eyes burned, but he didn't blink. He couldn't. Not in front of this man. "I do care," he said softly. Keanu tilted his head. "Then why does it feel like you're just passing time?" Mason didn't answer. He didn't have one. Keanu sat back again, his expression unreadable. "This place was built on intention," he said. "But everything I've seen tonight feels like obligation." Mason's jaw tightened. "I'm doing the best I can." Keanu nodded slowly. "I believe that," he said. "But sometimes the best we can do under pressure isn't the same as the best we're capable of." Then he fell quiet again, folding his napkin slowly, carefully, like every movement had meaning. Mason stood still. He didn't know whether to walk away or collapse into the chair next to him. And the worst part was, neither would, made him feel better. The room around them continued to hum with conversation and soft music. But Mason no longer heard any of it. The clinking glasses, the laughter at the birthday table, the muttered orders from Blake at the bar. They all faded beneath the weight of what had just been said. He turned and walked slowly away from table 13, not because he was finished, but because he needed space. The guest's words followed him like a shadow. "No one ever taught you to care." And worse, "It feels like obligation." He knew they weren't said with cruelty. That made them harder to ignore. He returned to the prep station, rested both palms on the edge, and stared down at the tray of cutlery. His fingers curled slightly. His jaw clenched. Every part of his body ached to defend itself, to push back, to say, "I care more than you know. I'm not just passing time, I'm holding my whole world together with these hands." But he said none of it. Elena approached again. This time she said nothing. She just placed a fresh lemon wedge beside a glass of soda, gave Mason a glance, and moved on. Her silence felt like understanding. Mason straightened up and returned to work. He cleared plates at table 4, delivered espresso to a pair of guests celebrating an anniversary. His smile returned, thin and stretched, a mask worn by habit, but the crack beneath it was widening. When he passed the kitchen window, Talia called out softly, "How's table 13? Mason didn't answer at first. He just exhaled through his nose. Ask. "He will." Hasn't touched the second steak. Talia's brow furrowed. "He's not tasting food," she said after a pause. "He's tasting something else." Mason nodded slightly and kept walking. Later, he returned to table 13 with a folded bill, anticipating a complaint or refusal to pay. But before he could place it on the table, Keanu spoke again. "Have you ever eaten Wagyu before?" he asked without looking up. Mason hesitated. "No, sir." "Ever been to Japan?" "No." Keanu looked up then, his expression neither disappointed nor pleased. Just present. "Then what are you doing selling me a $240 0-cent steak and calling it authentic?" Mason swallowed hard. "I just serve it, sir." Keanu nodded slowly, his voice almost gentle now. "That's what I thought." There was no malice in his tone, but Mason felt something inside him drop, like a curtain falling. He placed the bill down carefully and stepped back. Keanu didn't touch it. He just let the silence build. And in that silence, Mason felt the truth tighten around him like a rope. It wasn't just the food that was being judged anymore. It was the soul of the place. And somewhere deep down, Mason began to realize this man wasn't just a guest. He was here for something more. Long before Keanu Reeves became a household name, before the red carpets and cameras, he stood in the back kitchen of a steakhouse in downtown Toronto, sleeves rolled, sweat trickling down his neck, hands burned from hot plates and careless accidents. It was the summer of 1991. He was 26. The restaurant was called Avery's. It wasn't fancy. It didn't serve wine flights or imported meats. It was the kind of place where regulars drank the same draft beer every week and the steak came with fries, no questions asked. Keanu had taken the job between roles. He didn't need the money, not really. He needed something else. A reset. Every night he wore the same black apron, the same scuffed black shoes, the same expressionless mask as the other busboys and servers. He took orders, cleared plates, wiped down menus. The managers didn't know who he was. Some of the kitchen crew vaguely recognized him from an old TV role, but no one cared, not there. And that's why he stayed. The work was hard, the hours were brutal. The cooks cursed like sailors and the dish pit smelled like steam and bleach. But there was something sacred in the rhythm of it all. The way a perfect plate slid across the line. The sound of knives against cutting boards. The nod from an old customer who always tipped 20%, no matter what. The sous-chef, Keanu remembered the burns, the weight of trays, the sting in his knees from standing too long. But more than that, he remembered the dignity, the invisible pride in doing something well, even when no one was watching. He'd learned things in that kitchen no acting class had ever taught him, like how the strongest people often said the least, how kindness, even in a rush, could hold someone together for one more hour, and how respect wasn't something you demanded, it was something you proved. Years later, when his fame had caught fire and the roles grew bigger, Keanu never forgot that kitchen. Not the heat, not the silence, not the feeling of belonging without expectation. That memory became the foundation for Oak and Ember. When he first envisioned it, he told his team, "No celebrity branding, no gimmicks. If my name's involved, it has to be invisible." He wanted the place to speak for itself, through its people, through the service. He met with architects in private, chose the reclaimed wood for the beams himself, had the booths built to be wide and comfortable, not trendy. Every decision was intentional. Every detail meant to create the feeling he once had at Avery's, humble, human, and whole. Oak and Ember opened quietly on a cool Thursday evening. No press release, no grand opening event, just a handwritten sign that read, "Now serving." That was the point. In the first few months after opening, Oak and Ember thrived, not because of attention, but because of authenticity. Word spread quickly, not through tabloids or food critics, but from one person to another. A father told his daughter, a teacher told her colleague, a nurse brought her husband after a long shift. The food was exceptional, but it wasn't just the food. It was how guests were treated. Keanu would slip in sometimes, unannounced, always in disguise. He'd sit at the bar and quietly watch how the servers moved. Whether the hostess greeted each guest with warmth, not rehearsed politeness. Whether the bartender remembered a returning customer's favorite drink without being asked. Whether the water tasted clean. Whether the bread was warm. He never said a word. If something was off, he'd note it and speak to the silent partner he'd appointed as the operations head. But usually, he just watched. In those early years, the energy of the staff was different. They were proud. New hires were trained by veterans who believed in what they were building. Even when mistakes happened, and they did, there was a sense of ownership, of care. It was exactly what Keanu had hoped for. But somewhere along the way, it started to slip. Turnover increased. A longtime server named Jonah, who had once been the heart of the front-of-house team, left quietly after being passed over for a promotion. Elena stayed, but mentioned once in passing that something felt less warm lately. And Keanu noticed small details in reports, supply orders coming in late, notes from guests about rushed service, more comped meals. Then came the email. It was short, sent anonymously, no name, no return address. It read, "If you care about Oak and Ember, come see what's happening. We're losing what you built." Keanu read it twice. He didn't delete it. And 3 weeks later, after reading 2 more concerning reviews, one from a food blogger who had once praised the restaurant's soul, now calling it efficient but cold, Keanu made the decision. He would return, not as himself, but as a stranger. Someone no one recognized. No VIP greeting, no preparation, just a guest. A man in a cardigan and glasses, with questions only silence could answer. He didn't want to catch anyone doing something wrong. He wanted to see what happened when no one knew he was watching. And that's how he ended up at table 13, with a meal untouched, and a server named Mason whose hands trembled when he poured water. Now, seated quietly in the booth he helped design, Keanu let the weight of memory settle over him. He didn't see linen and steak and flickering candlelight. He saw the heat of the Avery's kitchen, the steam fogging his glasses. The cook, who once scolded him for using the wrong plate, then patted his back the next day when he got it right. He saw himself mopping floors past midnight, humming to distract from the soreness in his knees. He remembered the pride he felt, getting an entire section cleared in less than 5 minutes without dropping a dish. No applause, no headlines, just the quiet dignity of doing something well. That was why Oak and Ember existed. And now, that spirit was fading. Tonight wasn't about food, not really. It was about pulse, vibe, soul. It was about whether the people in this space were still connected to what it was meant to be, or whether time and turnover had thinned it out into routine. He hadn't come here hoping to shut it down. He came hoping to believe in it again. But watching Mason move across the dining room, Keanu saw something he hadn't expected. Not laziness, not arrogance. Desperation. The young man was clearly hurting, but he was still trying, pouring water with shaking hands, folding napkins with care even when no one thanked him, apologizing for things beyond his control, and still taking the blame. And maybe that's why Keanu hadn't spoken louder. Maybe that's why he was still sitting here. He needed to know if that fire, the one that burned in quiet workers like himself long before the cameras, still lived in places like this, still lived in people like Mason. Because if it didn't, then Oak and Ember was just another beautiful shell, and he wouldn't let it wear his legacy like a mask. He looked down at the untouched steak again, the perfect sear, the balance of color and temperature. But there was no love in it. That was the problem. You couldn't fake care. You couldn't garnish heart. He tapped the rim of his glass, not loud enough for attention, but with a rhythm that reminded him of the old dish line at Avery's, how the cooks used to signal each other with taps, knocks, whistles. Little codes of survival. He glanced toward Mason, who was folding fresh silverware into napkins beside the bar. Still pushing forward, his voice quiet, still not quitting. Keanu leaned back in the booth. He hadn't made up his mind yet, but he was getting closer, because places don't fall apart all at once. They fade, and sometimes it only takes one quiet man to see it. Mason set down the tray of appetizers on table 6 and forced a polite smile. The moment he turned around, the muscles in his jaw tightened. His back throbbed from carrying that tray too far with too little rest, but there was no time to feel pain. Not tonight. He stepped into the side corridor leading toward the kitchen, passing Blake, who stood near the bar with a clipboard and a grin far too pleased with itself. "Still limping, huh?" Blake said loud enough for 2 other servers nearby to hear. "What's the matter, Mason? Chairs moving faster than you tonight?" Mason didn't stop, didn't react, just kept walking. But Blake wasn't finished. Maybe table 13 should have ordered the server medium rare too. Might have gotten him faster. The words stung more than they should have. Not because of what was said, but because Mason had stopped being surprised by this kind of treatment a long time ago. He glanced at the 2 servers who looked away, pretending to be busy with menus. Keanu, from his corner booth, saw everything. The look on Mason's face. The short nod, the lowered eyes. The way he walked off, like he'd accepted this was just part of the job. Keanu's chest tightened. This wasn't just about food anymore. It hadn't been for hours. It was about what kind of place Oak and Ember had become when no one was looking. Behind the bar, Elena caught the last part of Blake's remark. Her eyes narrowed. She said nothing out loud, but her grip on the towel in her hand tightened until her knuckles turned white. Mason returned to the back to retrieve wine for a foretop near the fireplace. He lifted the tray with one hand, steadying it with the other. His fingers trembled just slightly, enough that he had to pause and take a breath before stepping back out into the dining room. 3 steps in, a child darted between tables. Mason pivoted to avoid a collision, and the tray wobbled dangerously. A full glass tipped, teetering on the edge. He caught it with one hand before it could fall. He didn't spill a drop, but his heart didn't slow down. Keanu watched it all unfold. The slight twitch in Mason's fingers afterward, the way he smiled and nodded to the guest at the next table like nothing had happened, like he wasn't unraveling one thread at a time. Keanu took a slow breath. "This chair," he said, his voice soft but firm enough to cut through the hum of nearby tables, "feels like penance." Mason turned toward him. "Bring me one that feels like care." There was no anger in Keanu's voice, no sarcasm, just disappointment, quiet and deliberate. Mason blinked. For a moment, he didn't move. Something in his eyes flickered, fatigue, shame, a growing sense of helplessness. Then he nodded and turned away. Again, Mason walked through the dining room with the stiffness of someone carrying more than just weight. His body moved, but something inside him lagged behind. He passed Elena, who watched him closely now, her usual rhythm behind the bar slowing as her instincts sharpened. In the lounge area, Mason selected a chair with padded upholstery and rounded back support. It was one of the few pieces left from the restaurant's original design, a chair chosen not for style but for comfort. He remembered that from his first day. A manager had once said, Keanu wanted this place to feel like a home, not a showroom. But that had been a long time ago. That manager was gone. Now the chairs were mostly for decoration. He gripped the legs and lifted. His arms ached. His knees resisted. He paused halfway, bracing the frame against his hip before readjusting and carrying it the rest of the way. When he returned to table 13, Keanu hadn't moved. The untouched steak still sat before him, the napkin still folded with sterile perfection. Mason slid the chair into position. "Here you are, sir." Keanu nodded slowly and shifted into the new seat. Then, after a moment, he looked up at Mason and said quietly, "Thank you." Mason blinked. It was the first kindness all evening. And yet, it didn't land the way it should have. Instead of comfort, it stirred a deeper unease. Like a reminder that kindness had become so rare, it now felt like a trick. He nodded once and turned to leave. At the bar, Blake raised his voice just loud enough. "You need help with that chair next time, Mason? Or should we order a forklift?" A few guests at the high tops glanced over. Mason's ears burned. He kept walking. Elena set down her mixing spoon and stepped out from behind the bar. She approached Blake without a smile. "Knock it off." Blake smirked. "Just having fun?" "It's not fun," she said sharply. "It's pathetic." Blake raised his eyebrows. "Since when are you in charge of my jokes?" Elena didn't answer. She just turned and walked away. Back at the host stand, one of the new hires watched the exchange and whispered, "What's going on tonight?" No one answered her either, because the air had shifted. You could feel it. Talia leaned out from the kitchen window, eyes following Mason's path across the floor. She didn't say anything, but she noticed the limp, the rigid neck, the speed that once looked efficient, now looking fragile. Keanu, seated in his new chair, placed his hands flat on the table and simply watched. He wasn't testing service anymore. He was watching the breaking point unfold in real time. And the man everyone had ignored, the one who never spoke out, never pushed back, never stopped moving, was starting to come undone. In the back hallway near the restrooms, Mason leaned briefly against the wall just for a second. He stared at the floor, eyes unfocused, the ambient music and clinking cutlery from the dining room drifting past him like echoes from another world. His hand still trembled slightly, but he wasn't sure if it was from the effort of lifting the chair or from everything else that had piled up around him. His phone buzzed again in his pocket. He knew it was Emily. He didn't check it. He couldn't, not while he was this close to falling apart. He pushed off the wall, straightened his apron, and stepped back into the light. No time for collapse. Not here. Not now. As he passed the kitchen, Talia gave him a look. Soft, uncertain, a hint of concern in her usually sharp eyes. She didn't say anything, just nodded once. Mason responded with a forced smile, the kind that held together like wet tissue. Back in the dining room, he went to refill a water glass at table 2. As he leaned in to pour, the pitcher tipped a little too far. A splash hit the tablecloth, barely noticeable, but enough to make the guest flinch. "I'm so sorry," Mason said quickly, reaching for a napkin. The guest waved it off, smiling politely, but Mason's face flushed. He dabbed at the spot, then stepped back and forced the words out. "Let me know if there's anything else I can do." The woman nodded. Mason turned and made his way toward table 13. Keanu was still watching. His eyes followed every move, each refill, each napkin fold, each breath Mason tried to hide. When Mason arrived at the table, Keanu looked up at him. "You ever think about stopping?" he asked. Mason blinked. "Stopping?" Keanu tilted his head. "Just walking away, right in the middle of it all, laying down the tray and saying, 'That's enough.'" Mason's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. He had thought about it so many times. On nights like this, when it felt like no matter how hard he worked, the pressure only grew heavier. When guests were cruel and managers were worse. When the world didn't even pause to notice he was breaking. But he never did, because he couldn't. "I've got people who need me," Mason said finally, voice quiet. Keanu studied him. "People who love you?" Mason nodded. "Then why do you look like a man who's been left behind?" Mason didn't respond. His throat tightened. Keanu leaned back again, eyes calm, voice even. "This chair feels better," he said, "but the air in this room is getting harder to breathe." Mason looked away, and in that moment, as he turned, Keanu saw it in his posture. Not anger, not defiance, just a man trying to hold his world together with nothing left in his hands. The break room smelled like old lemons and microwaved pasta. A flickering fluorescent light buzzed overhead, just loud enough to make silence feel impossible. Mason stepped inside, closing the door behind him. His hands were still shaking from the last tray. His ribs still felt tight from the chair. And now, the only thing that kept him standing was the knowledge that no one could see him in this moment. He pulled out his phone. 6 missed texts from Emily, a voicemail, and finally a message in all caps, "Call Mom now." He tapped the screen and held the phone to his ear. It rang twice before a weak voice picked up on the other end. "Hey, baby." His mother's voice was soft, fragile, like it came through layers of fabric. "Hey, Mom," Mason said, trying to inject cheer into his tone. "How are you feeling?" "Oh, about the same," she said with a tired laugh. "They stuck me with a new nurse today. He missed the vein twice." Mason winced. "I'm sorry." "It's okay, he was sweet, just nervous, I think." She paused, and he could hear the slight wheeze in her breath, the kind that had grown louder with each passing month. "Did you eat today?" she asked. Mason closed his eyes for a moment, then lied. "Yeah, I did. A sandwich earlier." "That's good," she said. "Make sure you take your vitamins. And drink water. I know you forget." "I won't forget," Mason said, knowing he already had. There was another pause, and then her voice dipped lower. "Emily said you've been working a lot lately." "I'm okay, Mom." "Mason, don't push too hard." "I'm fine." "You always say that." He didn't answer. He couldn't, because if he opened his mouth again, he wasn't sure the words would come out clean. He walked to the sink and turned the cold tap on, just for something to listen to, something other than his mother trying not to sound worried. "The baby said we might need to increase the treatment next month," she said finally. Mason swallowed hard. Yeah, Emily told me. I hate that you're carrying all this, she said, her voice breaking. I should be helping you, not the other way around. No, Mason said immediately, sharper than he meant to. Don't say that. But it's true. You did everything for me growing up. He gripped the edge of the sink. Now it's my turn, okay? She went quiet for a while. Then she said, You sound tired. I'm fine. You've been saying that since you were a kid. Every time something hurt, you'd say, I'm fine. Mason gave a soft laugh, but it was hollow. I love you, Mom. I love you more. There was a soft click. The call ended. He stared at the phone screen for a few seconds after, unable to move. Then, slowly, he slid it back into his apron. His eyes burned, but he didn't wipe them right away. He didn't need to rush this moment. No one was watching. At least, not in here. When Mason stepped back onto the dining floor, the shift in light was jarring. The warm, dimmed glow of the restaurant felt like stepping into another world, one where no one cared what phone call you just took or what truth you were hiding behind your smile. He walked slowly, collecting himself. But the tears hadn't completely dried. There was still a glisten beneath his eyes, a faint pink around the edges. He didn't bother to check the mirror before coming back. He didn't have time. A four-top near the kitchen had just finished their entrees. A couple at the bar waved their check presenter. And, in the far corner, Keanu Reeves was still sitting, still watching. Mason wiped at his face once with the back of his wrist, just enough to disguise the emotion as a momentary itch. Keanu noticed anyway. He'd been watching the hallway, noting the time Mason had been gone. Not long enough for a proper break, just long enough for something real to happen. And now, as the young man returned to the rhythm of pouring water and folding napkins, Keanu could see the weight he was dragging behind him. It clung to him like static. Keanu didn't speak. He just followed Mason's every move with quiet precision. The second steak still sat untouched. Mason stopped by table 13, adjusted a water glass, straightened the utensils slightly, even though everything was already in place. It was something to do, something to occupy his hands when his heart was too full. Keanu looked up at him, his voice softer this time. Was that your mom on the phone? Mason froze. His head tilted, just slightly. Yes, sir. She okay? She's sick, Mason said, then corrected himself. Dialysis. 3rd round this month. Keanu nodded. I figured. Mason blinked. How? Keanu didn't explain. He just said, You've been moving like a man with something heavier than plates in his hands. Mason looked down. His fingers curled around the edge of the tray at his side. I try not to bring it here. But it's already here, Keanu said. You can't leave grief outside. It walks in with you. Mason didn't reply, because he didn't know how. Keanu leaned back. He looked at the untouched steak, then back up. Wait, haven't you eaten today? Mason blinked again, caught off guard. How do you know I didn't? You lied when she asked you, Keanu said, but your voice cracked a little. You hesitated before you answered. Mason's throat tightened. I couldn't tell her no. I know, Keanu said. And then, after a moment of silence, but you've got to tell someone. Mason looked up at him fully now, eyes red, breath shallow. Keanu didn't offer a smile. He didn't offer a solution. Just presence. Sometimes, that's all it takes to keep someone standing one more hour. Mason nodded once, his voice barely audible. Thank you. Keanu returned the nod but said nothing more. He didn't need to. Because in that moment, everything that mattered had already been said. Mason stood near the server station, the bill folder in his hand. He hadn't opened it yet. The steak at table 13 still sat untouched. The meat had cooled. The butter no longer melted. It had congealed into a dark, oily pool against the edge of the plate. He watched Keanu sit in silence, unmoved, hands folded lightly on the table. There was no urgency in him, no restlessness, just calm observation, as if everything around him, the noise, the waitstaff, the flickering overhead lights, existed purely to be studied. Mason took a breath and finally tucked the check inside the folder. $240.00. Wagyu tomahawk steak, wine pairing, service charge included. No comps, no apologies. He walked the bill over like it was a sealed verdict and placed it gently in front of Keanu. Keanu didn't touch it. Not at first. He reached slowly for his fork, sliced a final piece of steak and brought it to his lips. He chewed without blinking, without comment. Then he set the fork down, folded his napkin, and looked up at Mason. "This meal," he said, his voice low, steady, "tastes like someone gave up." Mason didn't flinch. Not anymore. There was no reaction left in him to give, no defense. He nodded once, softly. "I understand." He turned slightly to leave, but Keanu's voice came again, sharper now. Mason froze. Keanu reached for the bill folder, opened it, and looked at the total. He stared at the number for a long moment. Then he slapped the folder shut and dropped it back on the table with a loud smack. "For what?" he asked, loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. "An insult?" The room stilled. Forks paused mid-air. Conversations fell silent. A table of tourists turned their heads. A couple on a date whispered to each other. Mason's hands stiffened at his sides. Keanu's gaze didn't waver. "You're charging me $240 for an experience that left me colder than the steak." His tone wasn't angry. It was honest. That's what made it worse. Blake looked up from the bar, confused by the sudden silence, and walked over with forced calm in his step. He approached the table like a man unsure whether he was about to greet a VIP or put out a fire. "Excuse me," Blake said with a rehearsed smile. "Is there a problem, sir?" Keanu didn't look at him. "Only that your service has no soul." The words landed like a stone dropped in water. The ripples were immediate. Blake's smile faltered. "I'm sorry." Keanu finally turned his gaze toward him. "I said, your service has no soul. I've been here 2 hours and not once has anyone looked me in the eye like they meant it." Blake's mouth opened, then closed. Behind him, Elena stepped out from behind the bar, her eyes locked on Mason, who hadn't moved. The young man stood completely still, his shoulders slightly hunched, his face pale. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The pain was right there now, visible, undeniable. Mason's fingers hovered just above the tray in his hands. He didn't look at Keanu. He didn't look at Blake. He stared forward, somewhere just over the rim of the bar, eyes unfocused. Not because he didn't hear the words, but because they landed too close to something inside him that was already fraying. So, it was the one thing he had been trying to hold on to. Through double shifts, through rent notices, through hospital bills, and cold dinners and nights that ended in silence, through humiliation, through Blake's jabs, through serving meals he couldn't afford to eat. And now, a stranger had stood in the middle of his world and told him it was gone. Blake shifted, trying to reclaim control. "I can comp the dish if there was an issue with the..." Keanu raised a hand. "Don't insult me." The tone was calm, but it stopped Blake mid-sentence. "This isn't about the food," Keanu said. "This is about the heart that was supposed to come with it, the care, the respect. And if you think you can just erase what I've experienced with a free dessert or a discount, then you're part of the problem." Blake looked like he wanted to say more, but couldn't find the words. Keanu turned his eyes back to Mason, who stood as still as a statue. "You should be proud of the way you keep moving," Keanu said softly. "But it's okay to stop. You're allowed to feel it." That was the moment Mason lowered his eyes. His lips parted slightly, but no words came. A single tear slid down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He just stood there, in front of everyone, a grown man, exhausted to the bone, silently weeping in the middle of a steakhouse. And no one laughed. No one made a sound. Even Blake took a step back. Elena walked slowly toward Mason, placing a hand on his shoulder. He didn't flinch. Keanu reached for the bill again and tapped the total with one finger. "This number? It doesn't scare me. I've paid more for far less." He paused. "But I wouldn't pay a dime for what I saw here tonight." The entire room remained still. No one moved. No one dared to speak. Keanu stood, finally, pushing back the chair Mason had brought him. "If this is what Oak and Ember has become," he said, "then it's no longer what it was meant to be." Blake's face went pale. Mason looked up, confused now. He caught something in Keanu's voice. A sense of ownership, of loss, of betrayal. Keanu looked down at him. "This wasn't your failure," he said. "It was mine." Then, without waiting for a reply, he turned and began walking toward the back of the restaurant. Mason stood motionless, the tear still drying on his cheek. The silence stretched for several long seconds. Then someone near the bar whispered, "Who is that guy?" But Mason already knew, even if he didn't yet understand how. Keanu paused halfway down the hallway that led toward the back of the restaurant. He didn't turn around. He didn't need to. He knew Mason was still standing in the same place, his hands motionless at his sides, his chest barely rising. Then, in a voice just loud enough to carry, Keanu said, "Come with me." It wasn't a command. It wasn't a suggestion either. Mason hesitated, his shoes cemented to the tile floor. Elena gave his shoulder a slight squeeze. No words, just a look that told him, "Go." He took a shaky breath, set his tray down on the service counter, and followed. They passed the kitchen doors. Inside, Talia looked up. Victor, one of the newer line cooks, raised an eyebrow as the two men disappeared down a narrow hallway that led to the private dining space, a room reserved for tastings, executives, and the rare few who knew the restaurant's original purpose. Victor whispered to Talia, "What's going on?" Talia didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on the hallway. Mason followed in silence. The VIP room door stood at the very end. Keanu reached for the handle and opened it without ceremony. The room was dim, quiet, and lined with framed black and white photographs, portraits of farmers, chefs, servers from around the world. It was a tribute to work, real work, the kind done with hands, sweat, and care. Keanu stepped inside, leaving the door open behind him. Mason hovered in the threshold. "Close it," Keanu said gently. Mason obeyed. When the door clicked shut, the silence inside became heavier. Keanu walked to the far end of the room where a small coat rack stood next to a mirror. He reached up and began to remove his glasses, then the wig, pulling it off in one slow motion. Last came the beard, carefully unhooked and peeled away, revealing the angular, unmistakable jaw underneath. Mason's breath caught. His knees nearly buckled. Keanu turned and looked directly at him. "You've been serving your boss tonight," he said quietly. "The man who built this place from the ground up." Mason blinked, his mouth slightly open. No words came. Keanu didn't move closer. He let the weight of the moment sink in. "I'm Keanu Reeves," he continued, "but not the version you know from screens. I'm the man who signed the lease, picked the wood on the walls, and chose the silverware you've been setting every night." Mason took a step back, bumping gently into the closed door behind him. I didn't know," he stammered. "I know you didn't," Keanu said. "That's the problem." He took a slow breath and walked to the side of the room, where a single chair sat next to a folded linen napkin and an untouched wine glass. "No one here knows anymore what this place was built for. Not Blake, not most of the new hires, not even the ones who've been here for years." Mason looked down, ashamed. He wanted to disappear into the floor, but he couldn't. He was finally being seen, and nothing prepares you for that. Mason stood still, barely breathing. His thoughts spun in every direction, but his body stayed rooted. He didn't know what he was supposed to say, how he was supposed to respond. All he could do was listen. Keanu stepped toward the table at the center of the room and placed the disguise, wig, glasses, beard, neatly beside the empty wine glass. I built oak and ember because I wanted to create something that reminded me of where I came from, he said. Not the movie sets, not the red carpets, but the back kitchens, the quiet service, the work no one ever claps for. He turned to face Mason again, and for a while, it worked. Mason's mouth opened slightly. I didn't mean to disrespect. Keanu held up a hand. You didn't. Mason fell quiet again. Keanu walked toward the framed photos lining the wall. That photo there, he said, pointing to an old black and white image of a woman in an apron, smiling while carrying a tray of dishes. That's my first manager. Her name was Evelyn. She taught me how to balance 5 plates with one arm, but she also taught me how to listen when someone says they're fine. Because most of the time, they're not. He looked back at Mason. Tonight, I watched you try to stay whole while everything around you was pulling you apart. Mason looked down at his hands. They were still trembling. I wasn't doing anything special, he said. Keanu stepped closer. You were doing everything right, and no one saw it. That hit harder than any critique. Mason blinked rapidly and turned slightly away, embarrassed by the moisture gathering in his eyes. Keanu let the silence stretch for a few moments. Then he said, You've been walking around with your head down for so long, you forgot what it feels like to lift it. Mason wiped his cheek once, quickly. I didn't know I was serving you, he said, voice cracking. If I had known. Keanu interrupted gently. If you had known, you would have smiled more, asked different questions, brought your best version of hospitality. Mason nodded. Keanu's eyes softened. But the fact that you still showed up, still folded the napkins right, still kept moving despite how much you're carrying, that's what matters. Mason shook his head. I thought I failed. You didn't, Keanu replied. He walked over to the small counter near the far wall, where a folder rested under a paperweight. He opened it and took out a crisp envelope. Then he placed it gently on the table between them. This is yours, he said. Read it later. What matters now is that you understand something. Mason met his eyes. This place, Keanu said, was never supposed to break people. He gestured around the room. It was built to remind them they matter, that they're not invisible. Mason didn't speak. He couldn't, but something in his chest shifted, just slightly. For the first time all night, he felt the smallest bit of weight begin to lift. Because someone had finally seen him, and not as a server, not as a name tag, but as a person. Mason stared at the envelope on the table like it might vanish if he blinked. His hands twitched at his sides. Part of him wanted to reach for it, tear it open, see the truth with his own eyes. But another part was afraid that maybe he didn't deserve what was inside. Keanu sat down across from him now, no longer the guest in disguise, no longer the distant observer. Just a man with tired eyes, and a memory that knew exactly how Mason felt. I'm not here to give you a speech, Keanu said, his voice steady but kind. I know what it's like to work just to breathe, to do the job not for joy, not even for pride, just for survival. Mason swallowed, still unable to speak. Keanu leaned forward slightly. I watched you tonight. Not to judge you, not to shame you. I needed to see if you'd give up. Mason finally found his voice. It came out hoarse. I wasn't strong. Yes, Keanu said immediately. You were. Mason shook his head. I froze. I couldn't speak up. I let people walk over me. You stayed, Keanu interrupted. You didn't leave. You didn't crack. That matters more than any line on a resume. Mason looked up at him. His face was pale, eyes glassy. I didn't know anyone saw me. Keanu nodded once. That's the problem. No one here knows how to see anymore. Not truly. Mason reached slowly for the envelope, but didn't open it. He just held it in his lap like it carried something heavier than paper. "What is this?" "It's a beginning," Keanu said. "Inside is a letter offering you a full scholarship to the Leadership Mentorship Program we run through Oak and Ember. It's not public. It's for people like you, people who show up when it's hard." Mason blinked. "I can't afford training right now." "You don't have to," Keanu said. "It's covered. Everything. You start in 2 weeks." Mason stared down again. His throat tightened. His lips moved, but no sound came out at first. "I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything." Keanu paused, then added, "There's one more thing." Mason looked up. "The other envelope inside," Keanu said, "is a check." Mason's eyebrows lifted slightly. $15,000, transferred tomorrow morning. Mason's breath hitched. "No," he whispered. I can't." "You can," Keanu said, "because it's not charity, it's recognition. For every double you've worked, for every skipped meal, for every moment you put someone else first." Mason's face crumpled. He lowered his head, both hands now gripping the envelope tightly. "My mom," he said, voice cracking. "She can start treatment. I've been counting coins, skipping food. I thought maybe next month, if we were lucky." Keanu nodded. "Now, you don't have to wait." Mason didn't wipe the tears that spilled down his cheeks. He let them fall. And for the first time that night, he breathed like a man who wasn't drowning. Mason sat in silence for a long moment, his hands still trembling around the envelope. Not from fear this time, but from the shock of what he was holding. It wasn't just money. It wasn't just an opportunity. It was the acknowledgement that he hadn't imagined the struggle, that someone finally saw it for what it was. He wiped his face with the back of his sleeve, then looked up. "Where me?" he asked, voice hoarse. "There are others here, people with more experience, people who don't crack in front of customers." Keanu didn't smile. He didn't soften his tone. He answered with clarity. "Because you didn't stop." Mason frowned, confused. "You kept going when it would have been easier to quit, when Blake mocked you, when the kitchen forgot you, when the guests didn't care. You stayed, and not out of pride, out of purpose." Keanu paused, then added, "You were invisible, and you still gave everything." Mason looked down again, but this time not out of shame. He was overwhelmed, like his body couldn't hold this much relief all at once. Keanu sat back in the chair, crossing one leg over the other. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It felt like rest. "I want to train you," Keanu said. "Not because I pity you, but because you're exactly the kind of person this industry needs in charge." Mason shook his head slightly. "I've never led anything." "You've led by example," Keanu replied. "And whether you know it or not, people notice. Elena sees it, so does Talia. Even Craig, if he'd stop hiding behind, 'not my shift.'" Mason gave a broken laugh. It was small, but it was real. He looked at Keanu, and for the first time that night, he didn't see the man from the movies. He didn't even see the owner of Oak and Ember. He saw someone who understood. A peer, a quiet fighter who knew what it meant to keep standing when no one offered a hand. Mason opened the envelope. Slowly. Inside was a formal letter of acceptance with the Oak and Ember seal at the top, a signature at the bottom, and beneath it, a second, thinner envelope, labeled in cursive, "For her." He didn't open that one, not yet. He just held it in both hands. "I don't know how to thank you," Mason said softly. Keanu leaned forward again, his tone light but sincere. "You already did." "Yeah, by not giving up." Mason closed his eyes for a second, letting the words settle. Then he looked up, steadier now. "I won't waste it." "I know," Keanu said. And that was it. No ceremony, no handshake, no cameras. Just two men in a quiet room, one finally being seen, the other remembering why he built it all in the first place. Outside the door, footsteps passed. The hum of the restaurant continued. But in that small, quiet space, something else had begun. A second chance, not just for Mason, but for the soul of Oak and Ember. A soft clatter echoed from the hallway just beyond the kitchen door. Victor had dropped the serving tray he'd been drying. Elena stood frozen beside him, her eyes wide and fixed on the monitor where a security feed looped overhead. The small black and white screen showed the front lounge, where Keanu Reeves sat calmly, still dressed in his unassuming chef uniform, quietly sipping from a mug of tea. Harry looked after her man. "Elena?" whispered. Victor turned toward her slowly, disbelief creeping across his face. She leaned in and spoke just above a breath. "That's Keanu Reeves." Victor's mouth parted slightly. "No way." Elena nodded, eyes still locked on the screen. "I saw him last year on a talk show. His voice, his face. I didn't realize it before, but that's really him." Victor stepped back, nearly stumbling into a crate of folded aprons. "You mean all this time? He's been here? In this kitchen?" Elena nodded again. "Washing dishes, prepping salads, walking to work like any of us." Word spread like wildfire, but silently, without anyone saying much out loud. A ripple of realization moved through the staff like a current beneath still water. No alarms, no announcements, just glances exchanged, mouths slightly open, and eyes darting toward the lounge. Even Diego, the grumpy line cook who rarely looked up from his grill, paused. His spatula hung in midair for a beat longer than usual. In the break room, one of the busboys opened his phone and pulled up a video titled "Keanu Reeves Surprises Fans at Gas Station." He turned the screen toward the others. The face was unmistakable. "Holy," someone muttered. No one finished the sentence. In the lounge, Keanu continued sipping his tea, occasionally nodding to the soft chatter around him. A few regulars were still seated nearby, unaware or unbothered. But behind the scenes, the walls were practically vibrating with shock. The door to the office cracked open. Blake stepped into the back hallway, his phone still in hand. He had been scrolling through reviews when a staff message caught his attention. One of the waitresses had simply written, "He's the real Keanu. Look at the cameras." Blake laughed at first. Then he looked and stopped laughing. He pushed into the kitchen, where the staff was now huddled in small clusters, whispering, occasionally peeking out. His eyes darted toward Victor. "What's going on? Why is everyone just standing around?" Victor stared at him, then gave a single, slow nod toward the monitor. Blake turned. He saw the screen, the face, the stillness. Everything left his expression. His jaw set tightly. A muscle in his cheek twitched. Without a word, he turned on his heel and walked out the back door. No one followed him. Keanu didn't look up. He didn't need to. Instead, he calmly set his mug down on the table and looked toward the kitchen with a quiet smile. Then he rose to his feet and walked toward the staff hallway, hands in his pockets. The kitchen had gone silent. Not the usual quiet of a mid-afternoon lull, but the kind that signaled a shift. Something irreversible had just occurred. Elena stepped back as Keanu appeared in the doorway. Every staff member froze. Victor straightened his apron. Diego cleared his throat, unsure what to say. Keanu scanned the room. Not in a theatrical way, not with authority, but with presence. The same presence that had made people weep in theaters. The same presence that filled interviews with calm and warmth. It was here now, in a linoleum-floored kitchen that still smelled faintly of burnt oil and yesterday's rosemary. Keanu gave a nod to Diego first, then Elena, then Victor. "You all deserve better," he said softly. "You've worked hard in a place that forgot your names. That's going to change." He didn't raise his voice, but it rang louder than a manager's speech ever had. Elena's lips trembled. Why didn't you say something earlier?" Keanu smiled gently. "I wasn't here to be seen. I was here to understand." Victor swallowed. But, "You're him. You could have." I needed to know the truth from the inside. One of the servers began to cry, the kind of quiet, overwhelmed weeping that had more to do with being recognized than anything else. "I saw how Blake spoke to you," Keanu said. "I saw who picked up shifts, who wiped tables, who stayed late without asking. You didn't do it for fame, you did it because you care." Behind them, the dishwasher stopped humming. Even the kitchen seemed to listen. Keanu continued, "Places like this don't fail because of the food. They fail because they forget people." He looked around once more, this time slower, memorizing faces. "Elena," he said, "I read your mother's get-well card in the locker room. I know you came in 3 weeks straight without a single day off." Elena's hand shot up to her mouth. "Victor," he added, "you stayed late last Saturday when the other prep cook didn't show. You didn't even tell anyone. I saw you through the back window." Victor blinked hard. Diego looked down at his boots. Keanu paused. "Diego, you put extra chicken on the plate for that older couple who split a meal. I know you thought no one saw." The line cook raised his eyes, stunned. "I saw." No one moved. The kitchen had turned into something else, a place of stillness, of reverence. Keanu took a breath, then stepped forward. "I'm not asking for anything. I just want you to know." "Someone noticed." He turned to leave, but then he stopped. "Elena," he said over his shoulder. She looked up quickly. "It's time this place had better leadership." And with that, he exited through the kitchen doors, leaving behind more than silence. He left behind recognition. Elena stood in place, stunned. Victor turned to her, eyes wide. "Did he just—" Diego nodded slowly. "He did." Nobody moved for a moment. Then, like a wave cresting, the staff began to stir, not with panic, but with purpose. Quiet hands started wiping counters. Someone straightened the supply shelf. A line cook called out to reset the prep list. Without Blake, without orders, the kitchen began to breathe differently. Elena walked toward the manager's office, her steps slow but steady. She opened the door. The office was still, the chair empty, Blake's nameplate slightly tilted. On the desk, Keanu had left a simple note. It read, "You already lead. I just gave the room back to you." Tears filled her eyes. She folded the note, tucked it into her apron, and stepped out to face the kitchen. "Let's get to work," she said. No one questioned her. The ripple effect was no longer quiet. It was transformation. And somewhere, down the block and out of sight, Keanu Reeves walked with calm steps, blending into the street like he always had, an invisible hand setting things right, then disappearing into the background. The morning light slanted across the front windows of oak and ember as Mason stood outside, taking a deep breath before pushing the door open. He wore a crisp black button-up, pressed slacks, and a clean pair of shoes. His name tag, once scratched and tilted, now sat straight and polished on his chest. His hair was neatly combed. No earbuds, no coffee in hand, just a quiet look of determination that hadn't been there the day before. Elena looked up from the hose stand as he entered. Their eyes met. She didn't say anything. She just gave him a small nod, and that was enough. Mason walked past the bar, grabbed a cloth, and began wiping down the menus, something he'd never done before. His movements were calm but focused. It wasn't about being seen anymore. It was about showing up, right. Victor peeked from the kitchen. He smirked slightly and whispered to Diego, "Looks like someone turned the page." The first guests of the day trickled in, a retired couple who always asked for the booth by the window. Mason greeted them with a genuine smile and walked them to their table. He noticed the gentleman had trouble pulling the chair for his wife, so he did it for him with ease. No fuss, no commentary, just a smooth gesture. "Thank you, young man," the woman said warmly. "It's my pleasure," Mason replied. At another table, a newer server named Lacey struggled to balance a tray of soup bowls. The edge of one dish wobbled as she turned too fast. Mason noticed it from across the room. He stepped in quickly, gently bracing the bottom of the tray with one hand and helping her steady the load. "Breathe through your step," he said quietly. "1 second slower makes everything smoother." Lacey looked at him, surprised. "Thanks," she murmured. Mason just nodded and walked away before anyone could make a big deal of it. From the kitchen pass-through window, Diego watched all of it. He didn't say much, but he found himself plating with a little more care. He wiped the rim of each plate now. He folded the garnish instead of tossing it. Not for a tip, just because it felt right. Customers noticed it too. A father with his 2 teenage sons commented to the hostess, "Did the place change owners or something? Everyone seems happier." By lunchtime, the dining room was nearly full. The conversations were louder, the laughter more frequent. It wasn't just about the food, it was the feeling. Something had shifted. In the middle of the buzz, Elena moved quietly between tables, straightening place settings, checking on servers, offering small nods of encouragement. Mason passed by her near the drink station. "Good shift so far?" he said casually. She smiled, just slightly. "Keep leading like that and it'll stay that way." He didn't answer. He just kept going, his shoulders relaxed, his pace steady. The restaurant felt alive again. By mid-afternoon, the regulars were lingering longer than usual. One older man, who always ordered black coffee, had begun chatting with the server about her art degree. A young mother with a toddler was brought a complimentary fruit cup from the kitchen just to keep the child entertained. These weren't corporate policies. No one had written memos or printed new guidelines, but something more powerful had taken root. Pride. Pride in each small moment. Victor started sending plates out with more attention to spacing. Diego surprised even himself by cutting herbs with the same precision he once saved for Sunday dinners at home. Lacey, the new girl, had stopped apologizing every time she approached a table. Instead, she smiled, because now it felt like they were all on the same team. At the corner booth, Mason cleared the remains of a late lunch with swift care. He noticed a napkin on the floor, picked it up without hesitation, and turned toward the door. As he walked past the window, he saw a familiar figure outside. It was Keanu. He wasn't walking in. He just stood on the opposite sidewalk, arms crossed, watching the scene inside with a content look on his face. Mason froze for a second. Then Keanu gave the smallest nod. It was barely perceptible, but Mason felt it. That one gesture spoke more than 1,000 words. He turned back inside without waving, without making a scene. He just walked to the hostess stand and helped Elena reorganize the waiting list. "How are we doing on table turns?" he asked. "Better than last week," she replied. "You doing okay?" "Yeah," Mason said, glancing toward the window again. "I'm good." The bell above the door chimed. A group of tourists entered, chatting and smiling. Mason stepped forward and welcomed them warmly, grabbing menus without being asked. He could feel the rhythm now. It was no longer a job. It was something bigger. Outside, Keanu stood for another minute, hands in his pockets, watching the quiet harmony unfolding beyond the glass. A child inside waved at him. Keanu smiled, raised a hand in return, then turned and walked down the street, disappearing around the corner. He didn't need applause. He didn't want a spotlight. He had done what he came to do. Inside, Diego flipped a pan of mushrooms and looked up at Victor. "Do you think he's coming back?" Victor shrugged. "Maybe. Maybe not." Diego smirked. "Either way, we're different now." Victor nodded. "Yeah," he said quietly. "We are." Later that evening, as the last guests left and the lights dimmed low, Mason lingered behind. He walked past the now polished bar, adjusted the chairs, and paused near the kitchen door. Elena stood wiping down the counter. She looked up. "You staying late again?" she asked. Mason nodded. "Just want to make sure everything's ready for tomorrow." She smiled, this time more fully. "You've changed." "So did this place," he replied. In the hallway near the back exit, he found the folded note Keanu had written to Elena, now framed and hanging on the wall. "You already lead. I just gave the room back to you." Mason stared at it for a long moment. Then, without saying a word, he turned off the lights and walked out into the cool night air. Across the city, Keanu sat alone at a quiet restaurant, finishing a simple meal. He glanced at his phone. No alerts, no headlines, no fanfare. Just peace. And somewhere, a place once broken was whole again. Because when dignity walks through a kitchen door, quietly, persistently, and full of grace, even forgotten places can begin again. The warm hum of conversation filled oak and ember as the dinner crowd settled in. Light jazz floated gently through the air, mixing with the clink of glassware and the soft rustle of menus. Candlelight danced on polished tabletops. Everything moved with rhythm, purpose, grace. Tucked in the far back corner, in a booth partially hidden by a column of ivy and a tall wine rack, Keanu sat quietly. He wore a navy jacket, collar upturned, a simple black cap pulled low. His eyes scanned the room without drawing attention. He wasn't here to be recognized. He was here to watch. Near the front, Mason moved from table to table, no longer just a server, but a floor manager now. He wore the new title lightly, with sleeves rolled up and hands never idle. He refilled waters, checked on orders, laughed with regulars. The ease in his walk was noticeable. No hesitation, no slouch in his spine, just confidence, built from small choices day after day. At table 3, a guest raised their hand, clearly upset. A steak was overcooked. Mason arrived within seconds, his voice low and kind. "I'm so sorry. Let me take care of that for you right away." He didn't argue. He didn't shift blame. He listened. "Would you like it refiled, or would something else make your evening better?" The customer hesitated, then smiled. "Just the same, medium rare." "You got it," Mason said. "And dessert's on the house tonight. We'll make sure the last taste of your meal is perfect." He walked toward the kitchen, disappearing through the swinging doors with calm urgency. Keanu leaned back slightly, a faint smile on his lips. A moment later, Victor emerged from the pass window wearing a clean apron and a serious expression. His once frenzied kitchen now ran smoothly. No shouting, no chaos, just quiet commands and focused hands. The younger line cooks moved like they respected him, like he had earned the title that once belonged to Blake. Victor stopped briefly at the bar to speak with Elena. She handed him a new ticket and pointed toward a table where a young couple was celebrating an anniversary. Victor nodded and returned to his post. Back near the booths, a small girl, no more than 5, sat at a table with her family. She tried to scoop up mashed potatoes with her spoon, only to watch it fall to the floor with a loud clang. She looked shocked, embarrassed. Before her mother could move, Mason was already kneeling beside her with a fresh spoon. "You dropped it like a superhero," he said gently. "No big deal." The little girl giggled and reached for the new spoon. Mason stood, gave the mother a reassuring nod, and continued on without missing a beat. Keanu watched it all unfold. His hands rested on the table, relaxed. That was what he had hoped this place would be. Victor emerged from the kitchen just as Mason passed by, wiping his hands with a towel. Their eyes met briefly. "You handled the steak well," Victor said. Mason nodded. "Learn from the best." Victor smirked, then nodded toward the dining room. "You see the girl who dropped her spoon?" "Yeah," Mason replied. "Cute kid." Victor glanced toward the back corner, lowering his voice. "She's not the only one watching." Mason turned subtly, eyes sweeping the booths. Then he saw him. Keanu sitting quietly, sipping water, barely noticeable in the shadows. For a second, Mason froze, not because he was nervous, but because something clicked. He didn't wave, didn't run over. Instead, he just nodded, a small, grateful gesture. Keanu returned it with the same stillness. Back on the floor, the pace of dinner service continued. Plates flowed out like clockwork. The bartender crafted cocktails with precision. New hires were being shadowed by older staff who actually cared. Even the music felt warmer, as if the restaurant itself had found its pulse again. At the host stand, Elena was helping a couple navigate the new seasonal menu. She pointed out a new dish, pan-seared halibut with citrus glaze, and described it with pride. "It's Victor's recipe," she said with a smile. "You'll love it." In the kitchen, Victor plated it himself, a drizzle of sauce here, a sprig of parsley there. He placed the dish gently under the heat lamp and rang the bell. No shouting, just one clean chime. Mason retrieved the plate and delivered it to the table with quiet enthusiasm. Behind the bar, Lacey noticed Keanu sitting in the corner. She froze for a moment, unsure if she should tell someone. But then she looked at Mason. Steady, grounded, and decided against it. This wasn't a celebrity sighting. This was family, returning home. Near closing time, Victor brought a small side plate to Keanu's booth. It had a single chocolate truffle and a folded note under the napkin. Keanu looked up. Victor set it down gently. "On the house." Keanu nodded. "Thank you." Victor hesitated, then said softly, "This, all of this, it's because you believed we were worth fixing." Keanu shook his head slowly. "I didn't fix anything. I just gave you back what was already yours." Victor swallowed the emotion and stepped away. Keanu unfolded the note. In neat handwriting, it read, "To the man who taught us silence can still speak. Thank you for staying invisible long enough for us to see ourselves." He folded the note again, held it for a moment, and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Outside, the streetlights glowed. Inside, Oak and Ember had become more than a restaurant. It was redemption, served with grace, course by course. As the last guests filtered out, Mason dimmed the lights. He walked over to the booth, but Keanu was gone. Just the empty glass of water remained, and the note Victor had given him, now folded neatly into a triangle and left behind, with one final line added at the bottom. "When the heart leads, the house follows. Keep leading." Mason stared at it, then tucked it gently into his vest pocket. Outside, Keanu walked beneath the streetlights, hands in his coat pockets, his steps unhurried. He passed a family laughing near the curb, a man playing saxophone on the corner, a woman waving from a bakery window. He didn't stop. He just moved through the city like breath through lungs, unnoticed and essential. Behind him, Oak and Ember glowed with quiet warmth, no longer needing a name to validate its worth. It lived in the way a spoon was returned, a plate was delivered. A team held itself accountable, not because they were watched, but because they finally saw each other. And somewhere in the distance, Keanu smiled faintly to himself. The restaurant had emptied. The lights were dimmed, chairs turned upside down on tables, and the hum of the ice machine was the only sound that filled the room. But one table remained lit. It was the same corner booth where Keanu had once sat in silence, unnoticed. Now, he sat across from Mason, the table set for two. In front of him was a plate with the same Wagyu steak he'd ordered weeks ago, the one that started everything. Steam still rose from the edges, and the marblin glistened beneath a drizzle of au jus. Keanu took a small knife, sliced off a piece, and speared it with a fork. He gestured toward Mason with a quiet grin. "You ready to try it again?" he asked. Mason hesitated for a beat, then leaned forward and took the bite. He chewed slowly, eyes focused on nothing in particular. Keanu waited. After a long pause, Mason nodded. "Better," he said. Keanu raised an eyebrow. "Better than before?" Mason nodded again, this time more firmly. "Definitely," Keanu chuckled. "Funny how the same ingredients can taste different when the energy in the room changes." Mason glanced down, then back at Keanu. "It's more than that. It's not just the food. It's what comes with it now." "And what's that?" Keanu asked. Mason answered quietly. "Heart." Keanu set down his fork and leaned back slightly. "That's the secret most places forget," he said. You can season a plate perfectly, but if the people carrying it feel invisible, the guest will feel that too. Mason folded his hands on the table, taking in the weight of the words. "I never thought I'd care this much," he said softly. "I used to clock in and out like it was survival, just make it to the next paycheck. But now, I don't know, it feels different." "It is different," Keanu said, "because now you're part of something." Mason nodded. "But I didn't create this." Keanu looked at him closely. "Didn't you?" Mason blinked. "You showed up clean the next morning," Keanu continued. "You steadied Lacey's tray. You handled complaints with dignity. You taught by doing. That matters." Mason looked down for a moment, his voice lower. "I thought about quitting, more than once." "I know," Keanu said. "But I stayed, mostly because you were watching." "I was," Keanu said with a smile. "But now, you don't need me watching." Mason didn't respond right away. He picked up his glass of water and took a slow sip. "Can I ask something?" he finally said. "Of course." "Why me? Out of all the people in this city, why'd you come here? Why this restaurant?" Keanu paused, then glanced around the quiet space. "Because it reminded me of a place I used to work in my early 20s, he said. "Same peeling tiles, same forgotten staff, same tired manager yelling about forks." Mason waited, leaning in, and because I saw myself in the ones who stayed. Mason sat with that thought for a moment, the silence between them filled with something heavier than words. He looked across the table at Keanu and saw not just a celebrity, not just a man who had quietly transformed a restaurant, but someone who had lived the weariness, the rejection, the aching effort of being unseen and still showing up anyway. "You saw yourself in us?" Mason repeated quietly. Keanu nodded. "Sometimes, the people who give the most are the ones who've been given the least." Mason leaned back in the booth, his shoulders relaxing. "I used to think no one cared what happened here, that we were just some run-down place in a city full of better ones." "Caring is contagious," Keanu said. "But so is indifference." Someone had to start a new cycle. Mason looked around the room. The chairs, the spotless counters, the framed note on the wall from Keanu's first visit, all of it pulsed with memory. "Victor's different now," Mason added. "So is Elena. Diego even smiles sometimes." Keanu smirked. "That one might be temporary." They both laughed, the sound echoing through the quiet dining room like it belonged there. Mason's face turned thoughtful again. "What happens now?" Keanu shrugged. "Now? You keep going. The story doesn't need a final chapter." Mason shook his head. "No, I mean, what happens to you? Do you disappear again?" Keanu looked at him for a long time, then picked up his glass, turning it slowly in his hand. "I go where I'm needed," he said. "Sometimes that's a movie set. Sometimes it's just a quiet booth in the back of a restaurant." Mason studied him. "Doesn't it get lonely?" Keanu didn't answer right away. He looked toward the window, where the city lights flickered in the glass like stars underwater. "It's not lonely when you know who you are," he said. That landed somewhere deep in Mason's chest. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was full, like a note held at the end of a song. Mason stood up slowly and extended his hand across the table. Keanu rose and took it without hesitation. "Thank you," Mason said. Keanu nodded. "Thank yourself, too." As they released hands, Mason looked toward the kitchen. "Victor's probably wondering where I went." Keanu smiled. "Tell him the steak was perfect." Mason turned to leave, but paused at the end of the table. "Will I see you again?" Keanu tilted his head. "You might, but you don't need to." Mason nodded once, then walked toward the kitchen doors, his steps light, steady. Keanu remained for a moment longer, then picked up his coat from the booth beside him and made his way to the exit, passing by the framed note one last time. He read it with a quiet smile, then stepped into the night. The door closed behind Keanu with barely a sound. Outside, the night was cool, the air crisp with distant rain. He walked past shuttered storefronts and flickering neon, his steps unhurried, his presence unnoticed by the world around him. But inside Oak and Ember, something lingered. Mason returned to the floor and found Elena standing near the bar, her arms crossed, watching the entrance. "Was that him?" she asked softly. Mason nodded. "Yeah." She didn't say anything more. She just smiled. They both looked out over the empty restaurant. Quiet, polished, breathing. In the back hallway, Victor leaned against the prep counter, arms folded. He had seen the same look on Mason's face once before, on his own, long ago, when someone believed in him without asking for anything back. He turned toward the kitchen and started scrubbing down the line, because the work never stopped. But now it meant something. And somewhere blocks away, Keanu walked past a diner, past a family arguing over dessert, past a boy helping his father fold a takeout bag. He smiled, because when grace begins in the smallest room, it never really leaves. The city had grown quiet by the time Mason returned home. He stepped into his small apartment, flicked on the dim lamp in the corner, and tossed his keys into the ceramic bowl by the door. The space was modest, just a one-bedroom with an old couch, a kitchen barely big enough for 2 people, and a narrow window that overlooked the alley. But tonight it felt like a sanctuary. He kicked off his shoes, shrugged off his jacket, and sat down at the small desk near his window. There was a notebook there, worn and soft at the edges, its leather cover faded from years of being carried around without being used. He opened it. Blank pages stared back. Mason picked up a pen, paused for a moment, and then began to write. "Mistake changed my life. Not because of the flavor, but because someone saw past the surface." He stopped and let the words settle. He thought about that night, the first bite, the complaints, the shame that crawled up his neck. And then the hand that returned. The man who returned, not with judgment, but with presence, with quiet conviction. Mason had always thought change came in shouts, in big breaks or big breaks down. But sometimes it came in silence, in a nod from the corner of the room, in someone showing up when they didn't have to. He continued writing. "I used to think being invisible meant I had no value. Now I understand it meant no one had stopped to look closely enough, until someone did." He thought of Elena, Victor, Diego, even Lacey. He thought of the new Mason, the one who stayed late without complaining, the one who remembered birthdays, the one who stood straighter because he was no longer carrying only himself. He paused and glanced toward the window. A distant siren wailed down the street, fading into the night. Then he wrote again. "I think we all just want to be seen. Not rescued, just seen." In that moment, Keanu's voice came to mind. Not something he said out loud, but something Mason felt deeply during their last conversation. Sometimes people don't need to be rescued, they need to be seen. Mason underlined the words slowly. He leaned back in the chair, letting the ink dry, and felt something settle in his chest. Not peace exactly, but purpose. And for the first time in years, Mason felt like he wasn't waiting for something to happen. He was part of what was happening. The pen rested in his hand a little longer before he finally closed the notebook and set it aside. The city hummed softly beyond the glass, like a quiet applause for a story most people would never hear. Mason stood and walked to the kitchen, pouring himself a glass of water. As he sipped, he looked around the apartment, noticing the tiny things that used to bother him. The cracked tile near the sink, the old radiator that groaned at night, the scuff marks along the floorboards. But tonight, none of it felt broken. It all felt earned. He returned to the window, leaned his arms on the sill, and looked down at the empty alley. Somewhere out there, he imagined, Keanu was walking in the dark, as he often did. Not to be mysterious, but because peace wasn't something you found in crowds. It was something you carried when you stopped needing the noise. Mason thought back to Keanu's quiet presence, his refusal to shame, his decision to act without announcing. It wasn't just what he did. It was what he didn't do. No speeches, no demands, just grace. The restaurant hadn't changed because of one celebrity. It had changed because someone reminded them they were worthy of change, and the people inside rose to that belief. Mason returned to his desk, opened the notebook again, and wrote one more line at the bottom of the page. We weren't waiting for a hero. We were waiting for a mirror. He tapped the end of his pen against the page, then set it down. In the distance, a horn honked faintly. The city was still alive, still messy, still indifferent in so many ways, but not entirely, because tucked into one corner of it, a little place called Oak and Ember had become something else. A story, a memory, a promise. And maybe someone watching this right now knows what that feels like. Maybe you've worked hard and felt invisible. Maybe you've wiped tables or changed sheets or stocked shelves and wondered if anyone noticed. Keanu's voice echoes again, soft and honest. Sometimes people don't need to be rescued, they need to be seen. You don't have to be famous to offer dignity. You don't need permission to lead with kindness. Sometimes, the greatest service is simply recognizing the people who've been serving all along. Mason stood again, this time slower, steadier. He moved through the apartment with the ease of someone who no longer apologized for taking up space. He turned off the lamp, pulled a blanket over the couch, and sat down beneath it, letting the quiet wrap around him like a final shift ending after a long good night. Keanu's voice offers one last thought. Kindness doesn't need recognition to matter. It just matters. The screen fades to black, and Keanu's voice lingers one final time. If you've ever worked behind the scenes, held it together when no one said thank you, or lifted others quietly while the world looked away, this story was for you. It's for the servers and dishwashers, the janitors and night nurses, the cashiers and caretakers, the ones who show up anyway, because it's not about being the loudest in the room. It's about being present in the silence. So let me ask you something. Have you ever worked hard and felt invisible? Have you ever done your best and wondered if anyone saw? If you said yes, even just once, then know this. You are seen. You matter. And the way you serve, the way you carry others, the way you keep going, it changes more than you know. Because kindness doesn't need recognition to matter. It just needs to show up. If this story touched you, please like, share, or comment below. And tell us, have you ever served someone with heart? We want to hear your story. Thanks for watching.